The Talksport Fan Network.
The ultimate on-demand destination for the UK's best fan-led football podcasts.
Want authentic supporter insight on all things Bournemouth? Follow Up the Cherries in all departments on the Talksport Fan Network.
Club-dedicated content created by the fans, for the fans.
Search Talksport Fan Network.
Hello Cherries fans and welcome back to Up the Cherries in all departments. Today I'm joined by David Stocks, the former AFC Bournemouth defender and captain, and we're going to have a look at his all-time Select 11. We're going to do this in two parts. This is the first part where we'll be looking at David's Select 11, his teammates that he had the privilege of playing with throughout his career, and the second part we'll be looking at the players that he's played against. And in that part there will be some real massive football legends that we'll be discussing. But for this part, I'm now going to welcome in David, and we shall start looking at the players that he has selected as his all-time Select 11. Hello, David, and welcome back to Up the Cherries in all departments. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. I'm getting older by the day, obviously, but I'm doing my best. Looking forward to it. I'm
looking forward to covering off some of these legends of the game that we'll be discussing today. So, let's start. And if we can start with the teammates that you've played with. Let's start with let's start with the manager. I know during our interview we spoke briefly about John Bond, but out of all the managers you played under, why would you pick Bondy?
I think the fact he came from West Ham, I always had a soft spot for West Ham when I played at Charlton. And they were all, back in the day when I was much younger, there was one or two rumours that I might be moving from Charlton to West Ham, which sadly never came about. But the way that West Ham played and the coaching side of West Ham, I think was ahead of its time back then. So he very much put the West Ham way, let's put it that way, into his management style, and as an ex-fullback, he was obviously very, very helpful. I have to say, we probably didn't get on as well as we could have or should have, but at the same time, excellent coach, and learnt an awful lot from him.
Yeah, I mean, he actually had a decent playing career as well. 511 games and scored 44 goals as a right back, which is quite a number of goals for a right back.
Well, he had a bullet of a kick, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
He could launch the thing a long way. And he really, even in his management years, was putting us youngsters, on the sideline in the way he was able to control and pass and kick the ball. So an awful lot of respect for him as a player, yeah. Ex-player.
Yeah, and he's obviously, during his managerial career, obviously managed Bournemouth, Norwich, Man City, to name a few. But a total career of 938 games as a manager with a win percentage of 35.4%, which I thought was quite an interesting stat.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I thought his win percentage might have been a little bit higher than that, to be honest.
Yeah,
But that's from research, and it might be not correct, but from
yeah.
my
I
research,
think I think one of the potential problems was that at times he was more concerned with how his team played and looked, as opposed to actually getting a result.
ah,
And I and one or two of the guys were there when he arrived. We were going to some pretty interesting places, to say the least, up north. The York cities and Bradford cities and such like. You can't at times play the pretty stuff at places like that. You've got to have a lot of players in the side who are prepared to actually, dare I say it, get stuck in and treat fire with fire. That's probably the polite. That's probably the polite way of putting it.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, in terms of teammates, there's only one place we can start, and that's between the sticks. And you've picked Roger Jones.
Mm.
I've got to be honest, I don't really know a great deal about Roger Jones, so it'd be interesting to hear what you got to say about him.
Yeah, I think he was hugely underrated in today's world. He would, in my eye, no doubt be a Premiership player. Excellent goalkeeper, very quiet guy. Just got on with the job of stopping people from scoring. Fairly basic thing to say, but that's what he's there for. So he wasn't one of these. How can I put it politely? Guys who were shouting and hollering and such like. He just got on with his job, and communicated with the back four. So yeah, in my eyes, and a very relaxed, nice guy. Not probably, I would say, your typical goalkeeper, but very, very effective. Big lad as well, which helped.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's represented some other fairly big clubs as well in terms of
Yeah,
Blackburn and Newcastle during his career. And he made over 700, I think something 783 career appearances.
yeah,
So that's a lot of appearances. So he's obviously well thought of across all the clubs he played for.
yeah. He's one
Um,
of those guys who you knew week in, week out what you were going to get.
mm, yes,
Very solid, and that spread through the team, if you know what I mean. The back four, I was very, very comfortable playing with him. And prior to coming to Bournemouth, I had played with some, decent goalkeepers, but I'd put him right up there. I think in today's world, he would undoubtedly be an international goalkeeper.
yeah. No, that's fantastic to hear because, like I say, I don't know much about him. So yeah, it's one of those as a defender. It's always nice to know that you've got a safe pair of hands behind you, isn't it?
Yeah, and he wasn't one of these that would be shouting and hollering all the time. He just got on with the job, did what he had to do. He was also a very good kicker of the ball, which obviously in today's world is quite important.
Mm.
So for me, yeah, in today's world, he without doubt would be one of the top.
Yeah, excellent. Could well have been an England goalkeeper in this day and age.
I think
Um,
so.
so if we can move on to the defence now, and if we can start with Terry Gulliver.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Gully, as he was known, and myself were the two fullbacks back when I played left back and was a bit younger and a bit quicker. I think I said that I feel he should have played at a higher level. He had decent control. He was very quick, deceivingly quick, and we never really saw many wingers go past him and get crosses in. I mean, back in the day, most teams played like a 4-2-4 type system with two wingers. I mean, Liverpool exactly were back in the day were a typical example. So the two wingers, and if you could quieten down the two wingers with a lot of the teams you played against, then you were halfway to a result. And he was as good as anyone. He was quick. Probably wasn't a physical player. Didn't need to be because of his pace, but a great player and a nice guy.
Yeah, I believe he signed from Weymouth. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And he
Yeah.
played locally. I mean, he played from memory. I think he played for Shaftesbury or Sherborne or somewhere like that
Yeah.
prior to joining the professional game. But
Yeah.
his pace was just incredible. He's probably the quickest I've ever played with.
Ah, okay. Is it true that he went out to South Africa as well and played out there?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, when he finished playing here, he went to South Africa. Gully was a single guy. He was. I've got to be careful what I say here. He was a single lad, and he enjoyed himself. But he was. Yeah, he was a nice guy, quiet, local. We used to take the mickey out of him because of his accent, because he was very Dorset,
Ah,
and most of us were not, having come from London and such like. But Gully was a nice guy, great guy, and should have played at a much, much higher level. Liverpool, I'm told, were very interested in him at one stage, following our sort of cup matches against them. And he could have played in the Premiership, no doubt.
yeah, that's I'm sure that's a bit of news for people, even from the days of watching Terry, that Liverpool were interested in him. So
Yes,
that's a very interesting fact. But yeah, so Terry, you're right back, and if we look for your first centre back at Derek Harrison.
yes, a bit of perhaps a slightly unusual choice, but Derek was at Torquay, and he came, I think, from one of the Midlands clubs, West Brom or Birmingham, somewhere there. Very underrated. And when he first came to Torquay, he'd been playing mainly reserve team games for one of the Midland sides. And he needed to be, how can I put it, persuaded to be a little more physical than perhaps he was. Because back then, anybody who was watching the games back at that time, the physicality of the game was, I would say, quite different to what it is now. So we sort of, as captain at Torquay, we sort of encouraged him to be a little more physical. You know, he was 6'2", 3", won everything in the air, could play as well. Very quiet, unassuming, nice guy.
So he's also, I think he was a bit of the Torquay legend, wasn't he? So I think he played over 100 times for Torquay.
Yeah.
And I believe he also represented Salisbury in non-league.
Yeah, I think he did. He was from memory, his wife, whose name I can't think of at the time, had a very, very, very big job. And I think Derek initially was sort of in her shadow, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But once he got into the team and the first team and dealing with first team and professional players, the sense of humour side, we found it eventually. But at the same time, you would not wish to be unfriendly to him, because he was a big lad who could, yes, very seriously take care of himself. So, but a great guy and a good player. Should have played at a much, much higher level.
Excellent. The next choice, Marvin Hinton, who I believe was a bit of a Chelsea legend, represented Charlton as well. But yeah, why is Marvin in your select 11?
Marvin was absolute class in everything he did. As a central defender, he was pretty much a midfield player, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
He would get the ball down and pass it. So back then, probably not the way that most central defenders played. You know, lots of central defenders are in the team to head the ball as far as you can and probably kick the ball as far as you can. Oh, and by the way, I'll probably kick a centre forward as far as I can as well. that that was the style. But Marvin was not like that at all. He was absolute class. He would, chest the ball down in the area and pass it. And you think, what on earth? And eventually I think he went to Chelsea.
Yes, yeah.
And he was such a class act.
Yeah, at Chelsea, I think he's like I say, held in quite high.
Yeah,
highly. I think it was as a career he made over 300 appearances, but he also won the FA Cup in 1970 as well, which I believe was with Chelsea. So, sounded like a bit of a defender ahead of his time.
Very much so. I think in today's world, he would be. He's an England player, and the way he plays. I mean, most centre halves back then were really used to sort of head the ball for a start, and probably kick the ball, and at the same time possibly kick one or two of the opposition. He was the complete opposite of that. The ball would go up in the air and he would chest it down and pass it, and you think, my goodness, what's he doing? But he was absolute class.
Yeah, sounds like a very cultured player at the time.
Very, very.
Let's have a look at, I believe, your left back choice, which is Brian Kinsey.
Yes. Well, yeah, I kind of have a personal issue here because he was the left back and I was the left back at Charlton, and he played lots and lots and lots of games, and for over many years. So consequently, for me to get into the Charlton side, I had to get in ahead of him. Prior to being a left back, he was a left winger.
Oh, okay.
So he was very much proactive in going forwards and on the ball. So moving to left back was as he said, it was cozy because left wingers back in the day, wingers tended to get kicked a fair bit by fullbacks and such like. But at left back, he was the one that had to sort of dish it out, as it were. But a top player, I was very unfortunate that I was at the club the same time as him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, he's gone on to make, I think it was over 370 appearances for Charlton. He's obviously very well cemented into the team there.
Yeah, always was available to play, never injured. And I'm his, if you like, his young deputy. So trying to get into the team.
Yeah.
And this guy is playing every week in, week out. So, I mean, initially he was a left winger, so he had quite attacking instincts. And in some ways, back then, I learned a fair bit from him. And so I suppose my development as an attacking fullback was helped by watching him play. But it was frustrating, but he was such a good player, and I'm his understudy, as it were, and unable to get in the team. And he never got injured or never missed a game. So it was time to move on.
Yeah, you can see why it's so difficult for players to break into teams when you've got such established players ahead of them, and obviously, with no injuries, and it does limit squad players the chance to play, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Frustrating, and when people are telling you you're a good player and you should be in the side and stuff like that, that's nice to know, but it's the end of the day, it's not really what you want to hear, is it? You want to be in the team.
Yeah.
So eventually it was obvious that he was going to continue playing, and time for me to move on.
Well, if we can move on to your midfield now. And this player I found particularly interesting when I was doing some research on him, Mike Bailey.
Fantastic player. I know that's a word that's used an awful lot, but he obviously played for England as well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately suffered from injuries over the years, mainly because he was a very combative individual. You know, once he stepped across the proverbial white line, it was game on for him. And that included training. So, you know, we would have, I mean, part of the book talks about some of the training sessions at Charlton.
Yes.
And you have 4 or 5 international players at Charlton, you know, England players and Scottish players. And honestly, some of the so-called 5-a-sides, they weren't 5, they were probably 7 or 8-a-side, were played on the car park out the back of the main stand.
Yeah, I do remember. Yeah.
And I'm just standing there, and I'm a young lad, and thinking, well, I've got the England midfield player, the England centre half, the Scottish right back, etc. And we would have matches, you know, England versus the rest of the world. And believe me, it was just incredible what went on, fights and all sorts. And mainly because there was this natural aggression in the players, but also because the winners of the 5 or 6-a-side would get a bottle of Coca-Cola after training. So there was no love lost. And the captains would be, I don't know, Mike Bailey and, say, Marvin Hinton, both internationals.
Yeah.
John Huey, a Scottish international. And after sort of running around the track, around the pitch, we'd go out the back to have this, and we'd play England versus the rest of the world. And Mike Bailey and some of the rest of the world guys, John Huey, people like that, they would pick their teams. So you'd end up with sort of 6, 7-a-side out the back. And it's England versus the rest of the world. I mean, what? You know, in today's world, I'm afraid you wouldn't get that.
No, definitely not. But it was quite successful. League Cup winner and also runner-up in the UEFA Cup, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, great competitor. Unbelievable attitude. I mean, I for a short while changed in the dressing room next to him when I got into the sort of first team squad. And I have to say, his influence on me in terms of sort of competing, it was just huge. I mean, I'm 18, 19, and my first time in a professional sort of dressing room, and I've got Mike Bailey on one side and Marvin Hinton on the other side, 2 of the, you know, top players, England internationals, John Huey in the corner, Scottish, and so on and so forth. And you would look around and think, oh my God, what is going on here? Because I've just come from youth team football. And I still played with my mates on a Sunday morning while I was a professional. I mean, played in the park down in London. And here I am changing next to 3, 4 international players. I mean, beyond words. It would not, let's just say it would not happen today.
No, definitely not. But what wonderful memories to have. And your next choice was another interesting one that I was researching into. Oh, we got gone through a couple there. Roy Matthews.
Yeah, very hugely underrated. Again, from Charlton. Charlton had back in the day, a very, very good scouting system. And a guy called Ted Croker, who played for Charlton, and his brother was, I think, Peter Croker, who was Ted Croker was the one who was involved in the England cricket setup. But Roy Matthews was a Scottish guy, again, very quietly competitive, but could get the ball down and pass it. Sounds very, very simple, but that's what he did. So he linked defence with the attack. And when you think back at that time, there were some very unpleasant midfield players around. To do that in midfield on the pitches, which were nothing like the pitches today, huge respect for him. Very quiet, unassuming, nice guy. Couldn't understand a word he said with his accent, but a great guy.
Yeah, he actually went to the USA and played in the USA, I believe, for Arcadia Shepherds, they were called.
All right.
And in 1974, he won the NFL treble out there, which was the NFL Championship, the NFL Castle Cup, and the NFL Bowl Cup.
Right.
So he had a successful spell in the USA by the sounds of it. And I believe NFL stood for National Football League at the time. I know it's called MLS now, but I believe it was called National Football League at the time.
Yeah, there was a few guys going out there, wasn't there, from around that time?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of players did, didn't they? I mean, a lot of Bournemouth connected players did as well. I think Harry Redknapp and Mel Machin being two that went out to America at some point in their career. I think Mickey Cave as well. So yeah, there's quite a few of the players around that time started going out to America, didn't they? Massively. But let's have a look at your next choice. And obviously, I suppose anybody that's played with him wouldn't have him in their best all-time select 11. And that is this man, Ted McDougall.
Yeah, what can you say? Just unbelievable. When I was captain, and when Ted first came to the club, I sort of introduced him around and stuff like that. And we couldn't understand a word he was saying. He was such a strong Scottish accent. So a relatively quiet guy for someone who could have been very loud and very full of himself, but he wasn't. Very competitive, very focused. All those expressions, those words that a lot of strikers, goal scorers talk about. When I've heard a few interviews on TV and such like from some of the guys who scored, lots of goals, they are a different breed. They're just focused on doing the thing they do best, which is it's very simple, but putting that little round thing into the back of the net of the opposition. All right, you have to have a bit of a service, and Ted had a great service with some of the guys in the team, Tony Scott and Bumstead, people like that, who were great at crossing balls, and the fullbacks, Terry Gulliver, myself. Although John Bond basically suggested that Tony Scott was a better crosser of the ball than I was, which he was. So why are you going down the wing and crossing balls? So it's all part of putting a team together and getting the best out of players. And to get the best out of Ted McDougall, you needed to put the ball in the opposition's penalty area somewhere, because he would be there. Unbelievable goal scorer.
Yeah, natural instinct of knowing exactly how to finish, wasn't it? And obviously had a good partnership with Phil Boyer as well, didn't he?
Yeah.
Who Ted obviously speaks very highly of. But what surprises me with Ted, and obviously he's got a autobiography out as well, is when I was looking and reading through that I think he only ever made like 7 appearances for Scotland at international level, which I feel, considering the amount of goals he scored, is quite astounding, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess at that time they probably had a few others, and I think back in that time, Scottish team tended to be made up of people playing in the Scottish leagues.
Right, okay.
There was obviously others
Yeah,
from England, but Ted was he. As a captain of the club at the time, and long journeys, Bournemouth to wherever.
yeah,
Ted was a very quiet individual. I think in a way Ted was I would say almost shy. Although to see him play football and sort of get wound up a bit, he wasn't like that at all. But him and I would sit on the coach going to wherever up north, and he was a very quiet, unassuming individual, and probably didn't fully understand how good he actually was. And I had lots of conversations with him, and I would say, so when the cross comes in, because mainly he scored goals from crosses.
yeah.
I said, but when crosses come in, what are you thinking, and what's in your head, and what's your brain telling you? And he said, I just go very, very calm, and I just put the ball in the back of the net. And I thought at the time, I thought, wow, that's that, yeah, okay, I get that. I mean, for somebody who didn't score goals, me, I sort of thought, wow, that's probably why I don't score goals. But he was just so focused on putting that little round thing into the back of the net. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Today's world, goodness me, how many millions would he be worth?
Yeah, it would be interesting to know that, what his value today would be. And but yeah, I mean, what a great career. And obviously he represented Manchester United, Norwich, Saints, as well as several other clubs as well, and scored goals everywhere he went, didn't he?
Yeah,
And yeah, still AFC Bournemouth's all-time leading goal scorer. So
yeah.
be interesting to see how long that record lasts for. But
I think he needed assistance. He was not one of these guys who would dribble and take people on and
yeah,
score wonder goals. John Bond, I think, was responsible for a lot of coaching with Ted, and the plan was to get the ball out wide. Tony Scott, Ray Bumstead sort of people, um, put the ball in and around the penalty spot ish, 6 yard box, that sort of area,
mhm,
and Ted would put it in the back of the net. I mean, it sounds very, very simple, but that's what he did,
yeah.
and he was absolutely amazing.
Ball in the right place, and then the ball's in the net, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's as simple
yeah,
as that.
yeah.
But yeah, well, next choice is a good friend of yours, Keith Peacock.
Yeah, he's. We used to call him Snatcher, known
Yeah.
as Snatch, because he used to score goals from nothing. Who scored that? How did that come about? Well, he's that sort of a player, and he was a very good mate of mine. I was obviously a defender. He was very much a forward, so we didn't have a huge amount in common. But in terms of scoring goals, again, a class act, a Ted McDougall, not as physical as Ted, probably didn't score that many goals with his head, but if the ball was in and around the opposition's penalty area, then Keith, or Snatcher as we used to call him, he would be there, and you would score a goal, and you'd think, well, who actually scored that? And then you realise it's Keith. He's just unassuming, just put that little round thing in the back of the net. Simple. The opposition's back of the net. So yeah, fantastic goal scorer.
Yeah, and
Nice guy.
yeah, and obviously an icon at Charlton, isn't he? And he's been inducted into the Charlton Hall of Fame as well, I believe. And yeah, a real suppose, one-man club kind of vibe with
Yeah,
Keith.
yeah. I think him and McDougall together, my goodness, you'd only need those two, and the rest of us will make the numbers up. It's just incredible. Although I think Keith needed less of a service than Ted did. Ted liked the ball put in the box, sort of in aerial or along the floor, whereas Keith would work his way to the goal himself, maybe play some 1-2s with his fellow striker, whoever that might be. So very different approaches.
Mm. And with him pictured here, that is a real classic retro Charlton shirt, I suppose, as we would describe it today, as retro. But yes, the badge is quite different today in comparison to what's on Keith's shirt there. But
I didn't pull on the first team shirt as much as I would have liked over the years, but my teaching, my understanding of the game and what was needed at Charlton was a big plus for me. When you look at the side back then, full of internationals, and these were international players playing in what was the old second division.
Yeah.
So, it was way, way ahead of its time, and that stuck with me. And when people talked about teams and players, I could hark back to the Charlton squad, and just so many good players in it. Having said that, other clubs, of course, had top players as well, and Ted McDougall and Phil Boyer. That era, was almost on a par with Charlton. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and it's sounds like Charlton was obviously a great education for your career, really, wasn't it? In terms of what you learned there, massively. Your next choice is a player who I believe played for the Foxes for Leicester City as well as Charlton. Lenny Glover.
Lenny Glover, yeah. Again, Lenny and I were good mates. We used to travel to the ground for training. He was a London boy. He used to call me a posh Londoner because I spoke a bit differently to Lenny and his mates. But Lenny was your typical Londoner, very confident, outgoing, a good quality, hard-working left winger who could take care of himself, because in those days, fullbacks, including myself, were very keen to let wingers know that this was not going to be an easy afternoon for them. And so the physical side would come out, but Lenny could take care of himself. He was a London boy. How can I put it politely? Quite happy to accept any challenge physically, let's put it that way. But a great guy. I used to travel to training most mornings with him on the train. So I got to know him very well, and went to Leicester and did very well for himself, I think.
Yeah, I mean, at Leicester, he was a FA Cup runner-up. I think it was 1969, was it? 1969? But played over 170 games for the Foxes, scoring 20 times. So, seems to had a good spell at Leicester. But your next choice is another Cherries legend, shall we say, is a name that's well known amongst the fan base. Ray Bumstead.
Yeah, I mean, this is going way back. Ray was an old-fashioned right winger, very unassuming, nice guy. there was always more to life than playing football with Ray. I think he had a couple of hairdressing shops out near Ringwood, and had almost a business life outside of football, if that makes sense. But a reliable, always fit, quiet, unassuming player. You knew what you were going to get with Ray. I got on really well with him. When we used to have practice matches, he would be the right winger and I would be a left back. And we used to have an agreement that I wouldn't kick him and he wouldn't kick me. Not that he went around kicking people, because he was quite a diminutive sort of guy. But great. Absolutely. And you knew you'd get every Saturday, no matter where you were, where you were playing, he would be there. He'd be there 100%.
Yeah.
Great guy.
Yeah, local guy as well. I believe he was born in Ringwood, and he also represented Weymouth during his career as well.
Yeah, that's right. Quite a good businessman. I think he had a hairdressing shop and one or two other properties and stuff. So he had quite an interest outside of football.
Yeah, sounds like a bit ahead of his time in that respect as well. Like looking after his interests after football.
Yes.
As well. So, but let's
very quiet and unassuming.
Very quiet and unassuming. Yeah, it's he's a player that my granddad, bless him, used to talk about a lot. It's great to hear your perspective of him as obviously someone who was lucky enough to play alongside him. But if we have a look at the substitutes you've picked, obviously this day and age we have 9 substitutes, but you've gone for 3. Actually, back in your day, it was only 1 substitute, wasn't it?
1 substitute, yeah.
Yeah. So you're being generous here by having 3. But
I think before that time there was no substitutes.
Yes, it would have been.
You just had to play on, no matter what your injury problem was.
Yeah, but this guy really interests me. Eddie, is it Eddie Firmani?
Eddie Firmani.
Yeah. Really good looking up on this guy. What a great career as a player and a manager. Very interesting career.
He was a really interesting guy. When I first joined Charlton, Eddie I think had been at the club prior to me joining and had gone away, played somewhere else and come back. But he when he went away to play somewhere else, he went to Italy. And so he understood and got taught the Italian way of playing, which was quite different perhaps to the way things were played back then in this country. And that included training, eating, sleeping, all those things that nowadays it's taken for granted, but back then probably wasn't thought about as much as it perhaps should have. So his training regime and the way he conducted himself, and simple things like eating and such like, and stretching and all those things which are peripheral around the game, but which nowadays I understand are very commonplace. So all those probably newish ideas, and a lot of this, I'd say most of it came from his time in Italy, where at that stage back then, I would suggest the Italians were quite a long way ahead of we were in this country on basically fitness and such like. So, and a touch player and a nice guy, very quiet, unassuming, brought up, I think, in South Africa. So he had an interesting accent, and he'd slip into a bit of South African stuff or a bit of Italian when you were playing, so it was a bit sometimes difficult to understand what he was saying. But I think in today's world he would be absolute class. Phil Boyer, well, what can you say? Hardworking. I think without Phil Boyer, Ted McDougall would never have scored the amount of goals he did. I think Ted relied very much on Phil, played with him at York City, I think, originally. And Ted was very instrumental in bringing Phil Boyer to the football club. And then on the wing, you had Tony Scott, who crossed the ball. So Ted was made up. He had crosses coming in. He had Phil Boyer did his running for him, basically. And I would say this to Ted. And then me, and I was just privileged to play with these guys. And because I'd come into professional football quite later on, my mum, I think I mentioned earlier, my mum especially said, you're going to have a career before you play football.
Oh, yes.
Imagine that in today's world, but I did. So I had an education. I worked a normal job. I was a 9 to 5 job. So in today's world, I guess it would be a lot different. But playing with these sorts of players, these what I would call top quality players, you kind of had to try to get up to their level, if that makes sense. And in terms of looking after yourself, Eddie Fermani was as good as I ever met. Phil Boyer was absolute class. And Ted McDougall scored more goals than you can imagine. And then me. So there you go.
It's a great lineup of substitutes there. I mean, if we go back to Eddie, when I was researching it, I believe he had a goal scoring ratio of 1 goal every other game for Charlton in his first spell at Charlton.
Right.
It was 100 appearances and 50 goals.
Yeah.
And he also managed New York Cosmos.
Yes.
And had the privilege of managing Pele, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. I think Eddie was quite capable of teaching Pele 1 or 2 things.
Well, it sounds like it with his goal ratio. So yeah, Phil Boyer, like you said, obviously played a massive part in Supermac's success at pretty much every club he played for, really, didn't he? He followed him around quite a bit. But,
hugely underrated.
Yes.
Hugely underrated.
Yes, I think that is sums him up pretty much spot on, doesn't it? He's a veteran of the game who made over 600 appearances. I think he was a League Cup runner-up twice as well. I think he was on the losing side both times in the League Cup final. And then obviously yourself, 461 Football League appearances and 5 goals. So, you're amongst the best here, aren't you, really?
Yeah, I didn't get into the opposition box very often. Ted McDougall, I can remember saying to Ted McDougall one day, Ted, how do you score all these goals and I don't get any? And I mean any, And he said, well, I can't do his accent, but you can. If you've ever spoken with Ted, you know that trying to understand him in his Scottish accent is not that easy, especially in the heat of the battle on the pitch.
Yeah.
But he just used to shake his head and say, I won't use the language, but I don't know, Stocksy. I don't know. I just get in the box and score. And that was it. And then when I spoke with the people like, say, Keith Peacock at Charlton, again, massive goal scorer, same sort of response. So Phil Boyer, he scored goals, yes, but he didn't score the levels I think he could have and should have. I think he was so keen for the team and to assist Ted, and he was that sort of an individual. It's almost you've got to be a miserable, selfish, self-centered individual to score lots of goals. I don't think Eddie Fermani was quite like that, but certainly the Boyers and people, the McDougals and people like that, they were not happy unless they score goals. And you want them to score goals because goals win you matches.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's been fantastic to look back at the players that you've had the privilege of playing with during your career. And next, we will be looking at your opposition that you've played against, your all-time 11 and your substitutes. And that concludes part 1 of my all-time Select 11 with David Stocks. Now, if you've enjoyed this show, please check out David's book. It's available on Amazon, In the Shadows, where David covers his whole playing career from his early days at Charlton all the way through to his days at Torquay and his life after football, which is a fantastic read. I recommend the book to anybody that's a football fan, especially from the 60s and 70s era. It's a real good insight into a player's career of that time. And those who watch the channel, also please check out our interview that we did with David, where we discuss his career, his time at Charlton, Gillingham, Bournemouth, Torquay. In the Shadows, again, the David Stocks interview, which is on YouTube and Spotify. So please do give that a look. And we will join you next time in part 2 of David Stocks' Select 11, where we'll be discussing some all-time great footballers from the 60s and the 70s. So please check that out. Until the next time, up the Cherries.
The Talksport Fan Network.
The ultimate on-demand destination for the UK's best fan-led football podcasts.
Want authentic supporter insight on all things Bournemouth? Follow Up the Cherries in all departments on the Talksport Fan Network.
Club-dedicated content created by the fans, for the fans.
Search Talksport Fan Network.